Greetings, everybody. So before I talk with you or play for you, I'd like to introduce you to our special guest, Dr. James MacGowan. Dr. MacGowan is a music theorist, a pianist, choral conductor, and a composer who teaches at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada, where he has won favorite faculty awards and teaching awards. As a very multi-talented individual, he specializes in improvised music and he has published in many jazz journals. And I thought he might be the perfect person to tell us about how he perceives and analyzes the David Baker Sonata of 1968, which we're going to hear. Welcome to Dr. MacGowan.
Hello from Ottawa, which is situated on the traditional unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. I also acknowledge that this presentation is being broadcast today from Wilfrid Laurier University on the shared territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. I extend my gratitude for the opportunity to be present physically and virtually in both territories. I am presenting this talk today to accompany Professor Heather Taves in her performance of the Sonata today. I'm happy to be part of this cross-university collaboration between Laurier and my home University of Carleton. Of special interest to me is that we are discussing the late, great David Baker, who was a brilliant composer and a significant figure in the history of jazz education, publishing 70 books and numerous articles and teaching prominent students at IU, including Michael and Randy Brecker, Chris Botti, and Jamie Abersole. Of special interest today is that Heather's personal connection, having studied at IU, where Professor Baker had been such an important figure in jazz studies and composition. In this short presentation, however, I would like to focus on Baker's work as a composer and his sonata for piano in particular. In the first part, I will focus on Baker's work and the social historical context and style of his leading up to the work's composition. I will then give an overview of the analysis for the sonata and what to listen for. One of the first things that strike me about David Baker and his sonata are the dualities on so many levels. These are the juxtapositions of contrasting forces that create a form of dissonance, both social and musical in nature. By a little context, David Baker studied at IU in music education in the early 50s, and this led to significant development as a music educator, but as a composer he felt unfulfilled, and he sought out and received a scholarship to study for a year at the Lenox School of Jazz in Boston with renowned jazz educators and composers George Russell, William Russo, and Günter Schuller. With Schuller in particular, Baker was introduced to third stream music that fully integrated contemporary classical with jazz styles. When he was hired by Indiana University in 1966 to establish a jazz studies program, he represented a stylistic minority with his focus on jazz in a school that, until this point, was effectively exclusively focused on classical art music. He was also obviously a racialized minority in the school. Both of these two dualities created some tension, but for the most part, he was embraced by a number of his colleagues who accepted Baker, commissioning new compositions from him and performing his music. He focused on musical creativity with writing music in a spectrum between art music and compositional practices and vernacular musical traditions. By the time he had written the Piano Sonata in 1969, he had already written a number of works that began to combine jazz and classical traditions, including the cantata Black America to the memory of Martin Luther King Jr. King had been tragically murdered the year before. Baker claimed that he struggled to integrate the academic writing of his university studies with the jazz and blues styles in which he often performed. The Sonata for Piano is a work in which Baker really confronted these differences. Baker later wrote that in combining jazz and art music styles, this Sonata for Piano is his, quote, most integrated from this time, and that it also is the most difficult of the sonatas to perform, end quote. Baker was never fully entrenched into one school of thought or stylistic tradition. He prioritized rhythm as influence from the music of Africa and its diaspora, as a paramount unifying element. In terms of melody, he was influenced by 19th and early 20th century Romantic aesthetics. For harmony, he defined his use as, quote, pretty much jazz inflected, changes according to the needs of the piece I'm writing. It might be 12-tone, in which the harmonies are incidental. It might be vertical, it might be bitonal or polytonal, end quote. Further, Baker himself described three contemporary composers as significant influences. Bartók's inclusion of folk materials, which Baker employs blues elements, modes, such as the first movement, second theme in A-flat Mixolydian, rhythmic drive, a key feature in the sonata's third movement, and the use of polymeter, frequent rhythmic juxtapositions, are all evident in this work. The role of tonal symmetry used by Bartók is also present with the use of octatonic pitch collections, as well as the structural bitonality with the use of tritones. Baker also cites Charles Ives as an influence, especially with the use of quotation, specifically in the third movement in this case, and the combination of diverse elements throughout, but foregrounded in the first movement. Finally, he identified Alban Berg as a noticeable influence. This is particularly true with Berg's Piano Sonata Opus 1. Berg's work explores free atonality with strong motivic organization, which is definitely a defining feature in this work, and mapped onto a 20th century adaptation of theme-driven sonata form. There is also some free 12-tone writing, but without any strict application of the system, which also aligns with Berg's approach with 12-tone music. Baker admits that there are numerous other influences on his compositional approach. One in particular is McCoy Tyner's use of harmonic fourths, chromaticism, and polyrhythms that he employed while playing with John Coltrane, after whom the third movement is named. Finally, the use of dissonance treatment was probably influenced by Paul Hindemith, as taught to Baker through Bernhard Haydn, who Hindemith taught and Baker studied with at Indiana University. The first of the three movements is called Black Art. The idea to compose the work came about at a 1968 meeting of the Black Composers Symposium held at Indiana University shortly after the death of King. In the compositional choices of the sonata, Baker made a conscientious effort to affirm and promote Black music in so-called learned circles. He sought to represent the complexity and vast richness of African American art in an eclectic effort to juxtapose diverse textures, styles, and moods. As modernism took hold in academic music circles by the 20th century, composers grew less interested in traditional forms, such as sonata allegro form. Nevertheless, Baker chose to set Black art in a loose structure of sonata, as we see here on the slide. There is no consideration of tonic dominant harmony in creating the form, but rather reliance on formal delineation based on contrasting themes. Further, with the exposition and recapitulation being identical in thematic content and tonal centricity, A flat for the second theme, C for the first theme, the form could be considered possibly more like a large-scale ternary form. Baker, however, was not concerned with any rigidity in his approach to form. He wrote in the monograph, The Black Composer Speaks, quote, I use all the available forms that come out of a tradition, sonata allegro and this kind of thing. I write a piece and then go back to see what the form was, end quote. In my analysis, in this example, you see the three-part sonata form structured bookended by an introduction and coda, both of which are closely related by motivic structure and pronounced pianistic gestures. I will focus quite a bit on this section as it effectively plants the seeds for the rest of the sonata. And I also point out the concept of musical dualities that are present here. As we can see in the example presented here, I've shown in blue boxes the examples of where there is strong contra-emotion virtuosic passages, which becomes a constant refrain that he uses throughout the movement, especially to change themes and transitional sections, and of course right here in the introductory section. We can also see this alternating high-low, soft-loud section highlighted in the red box. In this case, clearly presented in a way that emphasizes both dualities. But this comes back throughout the sonata. Again, a major feature that's presented in the introduction. The sonata is not tonal per se, but frequently uses triadic harmony, often as punctuation, sometimes as transitional materials, and sometimes within supporting harmonies. But in this case, we can see the punctuation role shown in the green boxes. You can also see the time signature constantly changing, especially in the first movement. But we see this prioritizing rhythm almost as a key feature like melody, more so than there is any kind of consistency in the metric structure. Finally, we can see in theme A, which comes in measure 12, the start of it, ba-da-da-da-da, is a musical gesture that is rhythmically expanded or augmented, and we see that here in orange, just before that, bum, 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 highlighted in the upper part of the register of the piano. This technique is used frequently in the development features sections of the sonata. We can also see the pitch-based motives, and here we see highlighted polytonal sections. In this case, an A-flat minor chord being used, but emphasized with different chords, different notes in the left hand. And similarly, in these punctuating chords, a couple examples: A-flat against A major, and C minor against a B-flat major. And we see this happening in many cases, especially in the third movement, which becomes a key feature of that movement. There are blues elements throughout, again, also prominently featured in the third movement, but here strongly presented as the very first gesture in the very first gesture of the sonata, where we have highlighted in blue that type of idea, or where we have in the blue highlights. Again, found throughout, also in developmental sections. For contrast, it's never that far away from the overall aesthetic. Quartal harmony, or harmony in fourths. Here we hear it represented melodically, and we see this coming back in different times as a chord. And in this case, just presented on the first movement and then developed later. Semitones everywhere, and here we see the first movement, the first bar, and the third bar, where I've highlighted some prominent use of the pervasive role of the semitone. But this is absolutely everywhere, and why this is important is not just because of its pervasive and presence throughout the sonata, but it also serves as a key part of this 12-tone row that comes back, highlighted here in the orange. We have 12 distinct non-repeated notes happening twice in a row, but when theme A comes back, we also have the 12 notes, not in a specific order at this point, but rather to show the chromatic nature with repeated notes, but the 12-tone freely used in this example. Again, the motive of half steps prominently used, but also fourths to connect some of the motions, and some thirds. And that particular pattern is used in freely, but in a thematic way in the sonata. So the sonata, recap, has these two prominent feels, more of an improvisatory feel and a sense of structure. The priority of rhythm over regular meter and the use of polyrhythms. There is which creates an improvisatory feel, and the free use of motivic elements, development and transitional sections, also creates this free-flowing, non-metrically stable, but also very strong melodic improvisatory feel. The sense of structure is definitely relevant here, especially in calling it sonata form, and we can see that again by the recapitulation being almost identical to the exposition. And in a basic arch form, the coda is sort of similar to the introduction, in which it brings in certain elements and uses them as concluding gestures for the end of the first movement. Moving on to the second movement, called A Song After Paul Laurence Dunbar. This is a song that is a song without words, but based upon a song that Baker also set in a song cycle that he wrote the year before that this work was published, and the same year that he started this sonata. Um, it's very somber tone, sometimes sad. It's an emotional space that's based upon the words, the lyrics of the song from the original poem that Dunbar had written, and also upon the melancholy nature of much of Dunbar's life from 1872 to 1906. The melody from the song that he published is the same, but the song is on a different scale. The piano work extends and develops the ideas much further to greater detail. Baker has gone on to say that the work has been influenced musically and also spiritually by John Coltrane's famous "A Love Supreme." What to listen for in the second movement? Listen for a loose ternary structure where this F Dorian sound comes back periodically. The theme comes varied quite a bit. In that sense, it's a little bit like variation form. But the ternary sense is visually depicted with a different key signature for the A middle section and the return of the A section. Written in F minor, but interestingly, it's frequently raising the scale over 6, so it's more like F Dorian. This movement brings back all the same motivic elements and pianistic gestures from the first movement, but it's more expressively cohesive because it's not trying to be a complete variety and intentional form of chaos, but rather creating one consistent mood throughout. And in a sense, it's also more stable metrically because there's a little bit more stability of a 3/4 ballad feel to it. Themes return, especially the lyrical B section from the first movement, plus many other elements that we just saw from the first movement description: contramotion virtuosic passages, alternating high-low, soft-loud gestures, triadic harmony punctuation, polytonality, fourth motives and chords, semitonal cells, 12-tone rows, and octatonic collections. The third movement, called Coltrane, is of course dedicated to the great jazz master who was a friend of Baker, and Baker wrote this movement as a tribute to Coltrane, who died again just before the start of writing this work. This movement is more instrumental than the other two, which were a little bit more quite a bit more vocal. The second movement being quite lyrical in the lines. The second theme of the first movement also being in that way. This is much more virtuosic and pianistically driven. At the same time, he tries to emulate some saxophone sounds and techniques that he knew that Coltrane had used. We can see this in the opening repeated note passages. Motivic and with alternate fingerings that might be used to reticulate notes for the saxophone. Motivic and gestural connections to the first movement continue, just like we saw in the second movement from that first movement, even as presented from the introduction to that movement. The dramatic first notes of the sonata are hard to resist. The repeated notes continue quite a bit, but they turn into repeated chords, and we see some octatonic collection notes being there, all highlighted in the boxes. We see all the notes that pertain to this C octatonic collection, and then we see chords that are separated by a tritone. They're triads, but create these almost like Petrushka chords that sound a bit like this. And now we're going to move on to the C section of this A, B, C, B, A form. In the C section, Baker simply transcribes Coltrane's solo from Blue Train, and the melody is presented for a substantial section from measure 126 to measure 173. In the score, it's elaborated and expanded and harmonically modified, becomes more and more dissonant as it progresses, but the melody transcription is there from Blue Train, the Coltrane solo from Blue Train. So arch form A, B, C, B, A, but after the C section, it just extends, and there's very few breaks. It just expands, and the intensity continues until the very end. The B section focuses on a bit like a stride piano feature, tritone pervasive harmonies, heavily motivic again from the fourths, the tritone activity, and of course the semitone motion that is pervasive throughout the sonata. The section C again is a quotation from Coltrane, but it actually is a 12-bar blues that gradually becomes less and less harmonically distinct and more free atonal. The blues devolves into a virtuosic storm using the established motives. There's a dramatic close, again centered with the repeated note C, and it makes a very flashy ending to the sonata. So thank you very much for listening to my presentation. Now please enjoy this presentation as presented by Dr. Heather Taves. Thank you.
So I want to tell you a little bit about David Baker because I met him when I was the age of an undergraduate here. I was about 20 or 21, and I was at Indiana University where he was the head of the jazz program and a distinguished professor. And I was a graduate student at the time teaching class piano to people who were taking it for fun. And I noticed among my students that in Indiana there seemed to be great separation between the white and the black students in my classes. And so I was very curious about David Baker, who was the only black faculty member on campus and a very personality plus. So he would come on campus, he was very tall, come down through the halls, say hello to everybody. And he looked really cool. He had amazing outfits, like he might be wearing a suede vest and some cool boots. And he was just so friendly and so unlike our great classical professors who I have to say were quite aloof walking down the halls for the most part. And as students, we used to kind of look at each other and turn and run away if we saw them coming. But with David Baker, he was a populist, so it was quite the opposite. So we liked him very much. And he started this jazz introductory class for classical geeks like me, so that he set up the orchestra room so that about 50 of us could go in, and he had like 5 upright pianos for the pianists. And then he would teach us how to swing a scale and modes and a few standards. And so his outreach was indescribable. He knew all the names of everybody in the class. So very soon he was saying, "Hello, Heather," down the hall. And so when I had to take a piano lit seminar, literature for the piano, I thought maybe he has some solo piano music. So I went to his office, and his demeanor made a very deep impression on me that day, because when I asked him that, he got very serious and indeed a bit misty-eyed, I would say, which surprised me given he was so upbeat usually. And he dug out a manuscript of this piano sonata that I'm going to play today, which was written in 1968. And it's an elegy really for Martin Luther King and for John Coltrane. So really difficult piece, I could see right away. So I wasn't sure if I could play it, but I told him I would present it in my class, and he offered to come along to the presentation, which he did. So that was amazing. And then I never really found the opportunity to learn that piece. It was hard as a young person to, at the time, competitions were the way forward, and competition repertoire lists did not allow me to play such a piece. So it was difficult to meet the demands of my career and to fit in learning this very difficult piece. So fast forward to today, actually to the beginning of the pandemic, when I was at home and decided that I needed a project to keep me going, and the Black Lives Matter movement came to the fore. And it was then that I realized that I wanted this piece to be my project, and it was time. And I really was very curious about it and about the legacy of David Baker. I thought it was extremely important, and indeed, as I've learned it, I've come to recognize it's a great piece of the 20th century. I think it's the equal of Prokofiev, Barber, Carter, and other great works of this time period. And really, there's not much excuse why it hasn't been played, because Indiana University, where he worked, graduates hundreds of pianists every year even. So I don't know why it hasn't been played, but it has been recorded by the distinguished pianist Karen Walwyn on Albany Records, who I thank deeply for that audio that helped me to learn it a lot. And it is also the subject of a dissertation, and apparently several dissertations. I've only been able to find one. So hopefully this will be the first video recording, and I hope even more that there will be many more, and that lots of pianists who are better than me will play this very demanding piece. Okay, just one tip for listening. You know, this is an intersection of avant-garde jazz and avant-garde classical. So it might not be really obvious to you how a way in to listen in the first movement. So if you're feeling that way, go to the second movement, which I think is the slow movement. It's very lyrical, and it's my favorite movement. And don't miss that one. And then the third movement, Coltrane. Well, if you know anything about Coltrane, you know it's going to be fast and have a lot of chops, which it does. And I'm going to do my best. So please enjoy.